Assalamu alaikum. In this presentation, I will be presenting about psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers and the preventative role of occupational health and safety intervention in reducing and mitigating these symptoms among domestic workers. This presentation is presented by Hissa Ahmed al-Sha'ar, a master's student in the University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Domestic workers are workers who help society to function, to develop and grow. However, these workers are often undervalued. This lack of recognition, combined with other psychosocial risk factors, including occupational risk factor, social risk factor, it can create an environment where stress, anxiety, depression can be present. As reported by the International Labour Organization, high-income countries like Arab countries, North America, part of Europe, have the highest number of migrant domestic workers. And in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries only, the domestic workers account for 20 to 25% of the total workforce. For this reason, a preliminary review of this paper includes a preliminary review of the current literature talking about the prevalence of psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers and the potential role of occupational health and safety intervention in reducing adverse outcomes. For the preliminary literature review, the methodology used is including first the database and search strategy. So to ensure a structured synthesis of existing evidence of the prevalence of psychosocial symptoms and occupational health and safety intervention among domestic workers, we did a rapid systematic search strategy, including that the data were extracted from databases such as Scopus and PubMed in the years between 2014 and 2026. This table shows the search strategies record. For the inclusion-exclusion criteria and study screening is that we included articles that is English-based with full text access that reports on the prevalence of psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers and health and safety intervention preventing these symptoms. Non-English articles, opinion-based blog, commentaries, and non-primary research format, and studies with no full text access were excluded. For the study screening is that we did scan the titles, abstracts, keywords, and sample characteristic, and the tool evaluating the psychosocial symptoms in this paper is the depression, anxiety, and stress scale tool that evaluate the psychosocial symptoms. These were used to identify studies that met the eligibility criteria and included in this paper. For the literature review, finding and discussion. For the psychosocial hazard, there was a qualitative study on the psychological health seeking among Filipino domestic workers in the United Kingdom. It showed that they were experiencing abuse, and most participants employed in a private household and residential care homes. This increased their vulnerability to work-related exploitation, abuse, and forced labor. The study highlights that some workers endure different types of abuse, including verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. The psychosocial hazard. Another study included in this literature review that domestic workers in Nigeria describing their experience of humiliation, exploitation, and limited control over their work. Additionally, They complained about working for long period of hours and having unstructured working hours, that they experienced their uh, life as their employers doesn't see them as a human being who needs rest and personal demands, which in turn increase the life work life conflicts. Many studies have shown that prolonged exposure to work-related stress and other psychosocial hazard can have impact on the psychological and physical health. There was an association from a study that shows an association between work-related mental health indicators like stress, sleep disturbance, anxiety, and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Psychosocial risk can be characterized as working condition where it negatively affect the workers. These can be workloads, lack of communication between employer and employees, violence, sexual harassment, and not enough days off, and also job insecurity. Such working condition may increase psychosocial symptoms like stress, anxiety, and depression. Addressing these psychosocial symptoms is essential that these feelings are most common among workers, and it's one of the most common mental health challenges faced by domestic workers. For example, stress is a natural psychological and physiological response of the body to a change or a challenge. However, in a study, in one of the literatures reviews reviewed, it, it was reported that workers experiencing discrimination based on their occupational status were experiencing significant amount of stress level. The second feelings reported is the anxiety. It's a mental health disorder resulting from a complex interaction like social factors, psychological, biological factor, where people experiencing fear, worry, and these feelings are accompanied by body tension, cognitive and behavioral symptoms. This can be present when a conflict between employer and employee can cause anxiety, instability, and aggressive behaviors. Anxiety can worsen in this case. Last feelings included in this preliminary literature review is the depression. Depression is a mental disorder when a person have continuous feeling of sadness for or loss of interest for a long period of time. Common features of this disorder, like sadness, emptiness, irritability, and cognitive change, it can affect individuals' ability to function and perform their work. Domestic workers who experience depression may become, in some literatures, it was reported that domestic workers who experience depression, they may become alcoholic and abuse substances, which can cause behavioral change that affect their performance at work. Contextual evidence from previous study. I have included two studies from one from Hong Kong and another one from Malaysia. So from Hong Kong, there is a Filipino foreign domestic helpers where the depression, anxiety, stress scale 21 assessment tool were used to evaluate their depressive symptoms, and the results showed that 25% point two, which is a high percent of domestic workers experiencing mild to extremely severe depressive symptoms. In this study, it was reported that participants who experienced physical and verbal abuse were positively linked with high depressive symptoms, according to the question, the questionnaire or the depression, anxiety, stress scale. In the Hong Kong study, It was pointed out that some participants who had refused to disclose whether they are experiencing physical abuse showed higher depression score compared to those who clearly reported their abuse. So, the participant who did not disclose their abuse showed higher depression rates compared to the participant who expressed their experience of abuse. This suggests that, that most psychologically vulnerable workers and may avoid expressing their experience due to fear and isolation, or sometimes due to feeling guilty. Another study from Malaysia is that they utilize the depression anxiety stress tool to measure the prevalence of stress, anxiety, and depression among Indonesian migrant workers. And the study revealed that anxiety level was around 53.3%, stress was 25.6%, depression is 23.6 among selected sample. The study offers an important insight into how demographic characteristic and specific working conditions, like working for a long period of times, can impact migrant health workers. So both studies suggest that depressive symptoms are a real psychological concern among domestic workers or migrant workers. For this reason, I'm choosing the depression anxiety stress scale, a 21 scale, to guide the proposed pilot study in the that will be applied among domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates. The risk coming from non-disclosure from participant, it represents a methodological challenge concerning the data validity and trust from participant. This will encourage us to evaluate the feasibility and translation of and perceived safety of our questionnaire delivery method among domestic workers in the UAE to ensure that the data collection process is both methodologically sound and the that the this questionnaire respect that participants are diverse while upholding the highest ethics and confidentiality. In the discussion part, it was evaluated or it was shown that domestic workers across different regions are constantly exposed to psychological hazard due to the workplace management, where some risk factors include working for a long period of time, having heavy workloads, limited authority or limited autonomy and decision making in their workplace, inadequate social and emotional support. These factors worsens the participant or the domestic workers' psychosocial symptoms. Psychological risk emerge when essential aspects of the work environment are neglected. So these aspects, when neglected, we are expecting psychological or psychosocial risk to emerge, like job design, where there is no role clarity, workload, and there is no decision making. A social setting is that when where there is lack of support from employees, from employees, employers, their families, and there is no access to help, to seek help from others. Working condition is that uh, some workers, domestic workers particularly, are working in isolating environment where it make them more vulnerable to have lack of rest, having heavy workloads and unstructured working hours and unsafe working environment. Migrant domestic workers often work in a private, isolated household which uh, which can make them uh, vulnerable to verbal, emotional, physical abuse, make them feel that there is cultural barriers and immigration-related stressors or problems. The psychosocial identified in the previous literatures reviewed is that the stress, anxiety, and depression from the previous literatures reviewed, the this tool shows that significant psychosocial symptoms among migrant domestic workers are seen, as reported in the Hong Kong study, where Filipino domestic workers reported 25.2% depressive symptoms, and where abused domestic workers showed higher depression, anxiety, stress scale scores. In the Indonesian migrant workers in Malaysia, these are the percentage of the psychosocial symptoms caused by their working environment as an Indonesian migrant workers in Malaysia. And based on all these preliminary literature review, we are proposing a pilot study, starting with the methodology. So this pilot study will examine whether the selected research tool, the depression, anxiety, stress scale, and the samples, domestic workers, and the procedure uh, is the evaluating the psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers are appropriate for examining the psychosocial symptoms employed in the United Arab Emirates. This initial examination will help to identify potential limitation and to ensure that all is done in methodological framework, and it's sufficient to support the aim and addressing and evaluating the psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers. So the objective of this study is to evaluate the feasibility of delivering the tool, Depression Anxiety Stress Scale 21 questionnaire, to domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates, and to estimate the prevalence of psychosocial symptoms working in the among the domestic workers working in the United Arab Emirates. It will be a cross-sectional mixed method pilot study where the questionnaire will gather psychosocial distress symptoms, and the pilot phase will gather feedback on how participants felt after responding to the questionnaire. Because this part of the methodology includes a sensitive area where some participants may experience discomfort while answering the questionnaire questions. So we need to have an idea on and a feedback on how participants felt. For the sample size is that we are targeting a number of 40 domestic workers working in the United Arab Emirates, working for at least 1 year, who can read, who can understand either Arabic or English, and who are participants who are under 18 years old will be eliminated or excluded from the study. And for the sampling and recruitment, it will be a combination of propulsive sampling and snowball sampling, since that the domestic workers may be working in a private or an isolating environment, and the workers will be recruited from a licensed domestic workers agency here in the United Arab Emirates. The sampling instrument we are choosing is the depression, anxiety, stress scale, including a 21 questions revealing how a participant is experiencing which symptoms is more dominant, depression or anxiety or stress. This figure shows part of the questions included in the questionnaire. For ethical approval and population safeguard, it will be obtained from the University of Sharjah Research Ethic Committee, and participant will be given an information sheet that explain about the purpose of the study, risk and benefit, their confidentiality, and their voluntary participation because no one is forced to do this uh, questionnaire. And because, as I mentioned earlier that the depression, anxiety, stress scale 21 question is about psychosocial well-being, some questions may cause uncomfortable feelings, and any participant who shows any signs of unease, uncomfortable feeling, we will be asking them gently to withdraw from the questionnaire and the study, and it will be reported later on after doing the pilot study. In such case, the team will immediately also that we will provide them with information about the free mental health helplines and local support organization that may improve their current psychosocial well-being status. Management of psychosocial risk. Despite significant enforcement of legal requirement, management of psychosocial and psychosocial and physical risk. I mean, despite having legal requirements, recent data shows that workers are still exposed to the psychosocial risk, that leading them to psychosocial distress and other mental health outcomes. Where major challenges were showing that employers' non-compliance with labor laws can trigger and can cause these kind of symptoms: stress, anxiety, and depression. Domestic workers' limited awareness of their rights, of their uh, ability to have a right to work in a safe place, to have a right to know their rights. This can this is one of the major challenges were reported in this literature review. Also, there is a difficulty enforcing regulation in a private household setting because in isolation, we we mainly don't know what's going on with the domestic workers. So it is very difficult to inform or to enforce regulation among domestic workers who work in a private household. Based on the global regulatory gaps, it's showing that 10% of the domestic workers are aware and benefit from the labor protection. However, 50% are covered by restricted regulation, where 30 are completely excluded and work in an informal way. In some African countries, such as Ethiopia, domestic workers were excluded totally from the national labor laws. And in Lebanon, another example is that the legal system gives employers full authority, which can lead to working for an overtime. There is lack of autonomy and, of course, increased exploitation. It was found there is structural barriers where domestic workers work in private isolation household, making it difficult for us and for them to report any psychosocial concerns. And relying only on workers' feedback is insufficient for protecting their right and uh, for reporting that they are experiencing these kind of symptoms. The role of occupational health and safety in preventing work-related accidents and diseases is crucial. While traditional occupational health and safety intervention are mainly focused on preventing physical and environmental hazard, recent research is focusing on investigating work-related diseases associated with psychosocial uh, risk. So, giving the rise in the prevalence of work-related stress and anxiety, depression symptoms, it is advised for organization that they must prioritize the implementation of control measures, and raise awareness to mitigate psychosocial risk and symptoms effectively. This can be done by starting with risk assessment that include surveys, observation, group discussion, evaluating potential impact of psychosocial hazard. After the risk assessment, organization have to develop an action plan. Once we have an action plan, we will have a risk reduction intervention. And once the intervention is in place, the next step is to evaluate this intervention. Is it helpful? Is it reducing the risk or not? Another way of management of the psychosocial symptoms among domestic workers is that they workers or domestic workers and employers should understand that it's a responsibility. It's their responsibility to manage psychosocial hazard and seek prevention and seek help once needed. One of the studies of the mental health and psychosocial well-being of migrant workers under the kafala system, it's kind of a sponsorship that gives the migrant workers residence and the and employment are related to a sponsor. So a sponsor is responsible or have the authority on the domestic worker. So it highlights that some coping approaches manage stress among domestic workers are provided. However, a range of service can be used to support mental health, including awareness, raising activity, psychosocial health consultation that facilitate the access to also facilitating access to basic and medical care. In this research, it was showing that there is lack of awareness that these services are available, and the majority of migrant people do not know that they can have services such as health consultation, raising awareness of mental health activities, communication between other migrant workers, and many other services under the kafala system or under this study. In conclusion, we know that the psychosocial hazards have been proven to impact the domestic workers' physical and mental health, and there is an incidence of several cases experiencing psychosocial distress among domestic workers, which speaks for the importance of addressing and preventing these risks. Existing interventions are useful, but they remain insufficient for domestic worker sector or domestic work sector in general. Also, the recent data, it is one of the gaps that was identified in this preliminary literature review, that recent data about the domestic or the psychosocial hazard on domestic workers is very inadequate. And knowing that when we combine intervention from different aspects of work, like job design, social support, work experience, and working condition, it can improve the overall working condition, which will eventually improve the psychosocial well-being of the domestic workers. Future research should place greater effort on evaluating these symptoms among domestic workers and prioritize development of intervention that is designed for domestic workers, considering that they may experience risk associated with working in domestic work sector. And this is the end of the presentation.